The file came to me on a Tuesday morning, which is the only day the community market corridor smells like ground seed concentrate before the vendor carts arrive. I was standing at the dispensary window with a clay mug that had someone else's name scratched into the bottom. I had been using it for 4 months and never looked up whose it was, when the adjudication terminal in my coat pocket chimed 3 times, which means mandatory review. I pulled it out and read the summary, while the market corridor filled up around me. Velsorn Keith Yareth, 26 years old, third-line heir of the Keth Vareth delegation, which is one of the 4 primary Velkareth house lines with an active integration presence in this township. Integration candidate status, standard track. Compact integration bonding clause, Article 7, subsection D. Mandatory co-residency assessment triggered upon 3rd consecutive bonding clause refusal within a 36-month window. I read that last part twice. 3 refusals in 3 years. The Article 7 trigger exists because the Compact Integration Office has found, across several decades of Frontier Township data, that candidates with 3 consecutive refusals in a 36-month window are either experiencing an integration adjustment difficulty that requires adjudication support, or they are working the clause deliberately, filing minimum threshold participation to maintain their integration status without actually integrating. The mandatory review is designed to determine which. The 6-week co-residency assessment is the mechanism. My job as Grade 3 Adjudication Officer for Kethsorn 4 Township was to conduct that assessment, which meant 6 weeks of shared housing in the assignment block, daily structured interaction logs, and at the end of it, a recommendation to the Integration Directorate about whether Velsorn Keith Yareth's clause participation was genuine or procedural. I drank the rest of my coffee. Then I pulled up the full file. The first refusal had been 18 months into her integration posting. The candidate, a compact agricultural coordinator, 38, quiet record, no complaints filed, had submitted a bonding interest declaration under the clause. She had declined within the 72-hour response window. Her stated reason: incompatible professional trajectories. The adjudication officer who logged it had noted the reason as plausible and filed it without comment. The second refusal was 8 months later. The candidate, a compact infrastructure engineer, 41, 2 Frontier Township postings, also a quiet record, had submitted his declaration. She had declined in 41 hours. Stated reason: insufficient shared vocational framework. The adjudication officer who logged that one had added a brief note: candidate appears selective, monitoring recommended. The third refusal was 4 months ago. The candidate, a compact diplomatic liaison, 35 civic engagement record, 1 commendation, had submitted. She had declined in 22 hours. Stated reason: fundamental orientation mismatch. The adjudication officer who took that one had flagged it for mandatory review without comment, which is what had sent the file to me this morning. I stood in the community market corridor and looked at the 3 refusals and their stated reasons, and I noticed something. Every reason she had given was specific, not vague, not formulaic, not the standard decline language candidates sometimes use when they want to get a refusal on record without leaving an opening for a counterpetition. These were precise, considered, individually tailored to the specific candidate. Incompatible professional trajectories. Insufficient shared vocational framework, fundamental orientation mismatch. Each one addressed something real about the specific person who had filed. That told me something. It told me she had read the declarations carefully. She had thought about them. She had arrived at a conclusion about each candidate that was individual and considered. These were not the refusals of someone gaming the clause. These were the refusals of someone who was genuinely and consistently arriving at a genuine answer of no. Which meant the Article 7 trigger was, in this case, a bureaucratic instrument that had caught someone for being too honest. I finished reading the file. Then I sent the mandatory co-residency notification to the Shared Housing Assignment Office and asked them to prepare Unit 14 in Building C, which has 2 separate sleeping rooms and a river-facing window in the common area, and which I had used for 4 previous co-residency assessments over the past 12 years and knew to be practical and unintrusive as living spaces go. Then I sent the formal notification to Velsorn Keith Yarath. Her response came back in 11 minutes. It said, "I understand the Article 7 requirement and will comply. I want to note for the record that I have not refused the bonding process. I have refused 3 specific candidates for specific reasons. I would appreciate it if the assessment took that distinction into account." I read it twice. Then I typed back, noted and logged. The distinction is already in the file. See you at Building C on Thursday at 1400. She did not reply to that. I finished my coffee and went back to the adjudication hall. She arrived at Building C at 1352 on Thursday, which meant she had left wherever she was staying early enough to arrive 8 minutes before the appointed time, and had either stood outside the building for several minutes or walked slowly from somewhere nearby. I found out later she had walked slowly. She told me this about 3 weeks in, during one of the evenings when we ended up on the river-facing window ledge talking past the hour either of us had planned to. She said she had been trying to decide whether to be angry when she arrived or simply matter-of-fact about it. She had chosen matter-of-fact. I told her that was the right call. She said she knew. I had the unit ready. 2 rooms, clean, 1 key each. The common area had the window and a functional kitchen and a worktable long enough to spread survey documents across, which I had guessed she might need because her integration candidate file listed her vocational focus as geological survey assessment, same branch of the compact field sciences as a fair number of Velkareth integration candidates I had worked with over the years. She walked in and looked at the worktable for a moment. Then she looked at me. She was not what I had expected, which is something I have learned not to say out loud because it never lands the way it sounds in my head. What I mean is that her file had given me certain facts: 26, third line air, Velkareth house line, survey certification, and I had formed a working picture from those facts the way I always do with a new assessment file. The picture had been competent but not particularly specific. The person who walked into Unit 14 was specific, in a way the file had not prepared me for. She was taller than the average I had worked with from the Velkareth house lines, with the warm amber-pale skin of the Kethvareth primary tier, which carries a faint undertone of gold in direct light that shifts toward something closer to cream in shadow. Her hair was braided back formally in the deep burgundy red that is traditional for third-line Kethvareth heirs during off-court integration postings. Not because the court requires it, but because, as she explained later, the braid is something her grandmother taught her, and she keeps it because she wants to, not because she has to. Her eyes were dark gold, the particular shade that reads almost brown in low light, with a fine inner ring of copper at the iris edge that I only noticed on the 4th day when she was reading a survey document in the morning light from the window, and I happened to look up at the right moment. She looked at the worktable again. Then she said, "You put it near the window." I said, "Survey work benefits from natural light." She looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, which would remain true for approximately the first 2.5 weeks of the assessment. Then she set her bag down on the worktable and said, "I would like to establish something clearly at the start." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I am here because the clause requires it, and I intend to comply fully with every aspect of the Article 7 assessment protocol. I will complete the daily interaction logs, the weekly structured observations, and the final co-residency summary. I am not here because I have changed my position on the bonding clause. I have not changed my position. The 3 candidates I declined were declined for reasons I stand behind." If the assessment produces a finding of genuine participation, I expect the integration directorate to accept that finding without requiring me to demonstrate it by accepting a candidate I find unsuitable. I said, that is a reasonable expectation, and it is exactly how Article 7 findings are supposed to work. Is there anything else? She looked at me for a moment, then she said no. I said, good. Kitchen is shared, morning slot is first come, I tend to start early. The work table is yours during the day. I work in the adjudication hall most mornings and come back in the afternoon. There is a river-facing observation platform about 4 minutes walk downstream. I go there in the evenings. You're welcome to use it at any time. She said, I prefer mornings. I said, then you'll have it to yourself. She unpacked her survey documents and her 3 botanical specimens in small clay pots, which she lined up on the kitchen windowsill in a precise row with a gap of exactly equal width between each one. I noted this without comment. Then I went to the adjudication hall to file my initial contact log, and when I came back at 6:30 that evening, the kitchen smelled like something she had cooked that I didn't recognize, and there was a second portion on the counter under a cover. I ate it, it was very good. I filed that in the daily log too, shared meal day 1 unprompted. The first week followed a pattern that established itself without either of us designing it. She was at the work table by 7, survey documents spread in a sequence that had its own internal logic I could partially read, because I had spent 12 years watching Vel Kareth survey assessors work. I was in the kitchen by 6:30 for the coffee, quiet about it, gone to the adjudication hall by 7:45. She was never at the work table when I left, but the kitchen showed evidence of use. The ground seed concentrate dispenser moved slightly, the second mug on its hook slightly off-center. That told me she had been up before me and had gone somewhere before I woke. I found out later she was going to the river platform, in the mornings before 7. She had said she preferred mornings and she had meant it. The afternoons were shared. Not by design, not by agreement, but because the unit was the size it was, and the work table and the adjudication desk were both in the common area, and we were both the kind of people who worked in the presence of other working people without needing to narrate it. She read survey documents and made handwritten notes in the margins with a thin stylus. I processed interaction logs and co-residency observation forms for 3 other active assessments I was running concurrently. The room was quiet except for the river through the window and the occasional sound of her moving a document to a different position in the sequence. On the 4th day, she said, without looking up from her work, you haven't submitted a bonding clause declaration. I said, I'm not a candidate. She said, most adjudication officers are. The clause applies to all compact citizens in active frontier posting status within the township boundary. You qualify. I said, I'm aware. I have never submitted a declaration in 12 years. She looked up at that, not dramatically, just a brief, considered look, the kind that means a question has been generated internally and has not yet been decided upon. Then she looked back at her documents. She said, why not? I said, because the clause is a tool for encouraging voluntary integration, and submitting a declaration to a candidate in the middle of their mandatory assessment would not be voluntary. It would be procedurally adjacent to coercion. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is a precise answer. I said, it is also the only honest one. She did not say anything else about it that day, but she moved one of the botanical specimens from the kitchen windowsill to the corner of the work table nearest my adjudication desk, which I noted in the daily log under environmental detail, and which I thought about on the walk to the river platform that evening. The river at dusk runs copper-green under the Vel Kareth sky, which has a particular quality of late light that the Integration Township's founding committee had noted in their original site documentation as one of the primary residential quality factors. They had not been wrong. I had been coming to this platform for 3 years, since my second posting at Kethsorn 4, and the light still did the same thing every evening, shifted through amber into something quieter and wider that did not have a name in any of the 3 languages I spoke with any fluency. I stayed until dark. When I came back, the kitchen had been cleaned and the second portion was under a cover on the counter again. I ate it and filed the daily log. The second week was different in a way that was difficult to specify precisely in the official log, which meant I recorded it as co-residency adjustment period proceeding without friction. Candidate demonstrates consistent genuine participation. Daily interaction logs current. What I recorded in my own notes, which are separate from the official file, was closer to: she argued with me about the river platform on day 9. It had started simply. I had mentioned at the work table, in the course of a conversation about a survey methodology document she was annotating, that the river platform's sightlines were better in low light than at full day because the copper green of the water surface only showed its full range in the transitional hours. She had looked at me and said that was factually inaccurate. The full spectral range of the water surface was more visible in morning light, when the angle of incidence produced a wider reflective spread than the low-angle evening light, which narrowed the reflective band. I said I was talking about the visible quality of the color, not the spectral measurement. She said the visible quality was a function of the spectral measurement and could not be meaningfully separated from it. We went back and forth on this for approximately 25 minutes. She was wrong about the experiential quality of the light, and I believe she knew she was wrong, but she was entirely correct about the spectral physics, and she was not going to concede the physics to defend the experience, which I found I respected more than I would have expected to. We did not reach an agreement. She went back to her survey document. I went back to my interaction logs. But when I got up to make the evening coffee, I made 2 mugs without thinking about it, and she took hers without commenting on the fact that I had made it, and we sat on opposite sides of the work table in the evening light for another hour before either of us said anything else. I want to note here, for the sake of accuracy, that the argument itself was not unusual. I have conducted 14 co-residency assessments, and I have had disagreements in most of them, about the temperature of the unit, about which drawer the cooking implements belonged in, about whose turn it was to restock the kitchen supplies. Those disagreements had the quality of friction between people who are obligated to share a space. This argument was different in a way I could not pin down precisely at the time. It had the quality of 2 people who were each trying to get the other to see something real, which is a different kind of disagreement entirely. I noted it in my own records under the heading, tone, nothing more specific than that. But I thought about it that evening on the river platform, standing in the low light with the copper-green water doing what it does, and I stayed 20 minutes longer than I usually did before walking back. On day 11, she came back from the river platform in the morning and said, without preamble, "You were partially right about the evening light. The copper register is more legible in low angle. The morning has fuller spectral range, but the evening has better tonal coherence." I said, "I accept partial credit." She sat down at the work table. Then she said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "The 3 candidates I refused. Do you think I was wrong?" I set my coffee mug down and thought about it the way the question deserved to be thought about, which took a moment. Then I said, "No. I read the stated reasons in the file and I read the candidate summaries. Your reasons were specific to each person and accurate to what the file showed about them. Incompatible professional trajectories was correct for the first candidate, whose 5-year plan was rooted in the agricultural sector in a township 300 kilometers from your survey posting zone. Insufficient shared vocational framework was correct for the second, who had a civic engagement background with no technical component, and whose stated interests did not overlap with geological assessment at any meaningful point. Fundamental orientation mismatch is harder to assess from a file, but given the first two refusals' accuracy, I have no reason to doubt the third. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "The Integration Directorate's preliminary review called them evasive." I said, "The preliminary review was done by an officer who spent 4 minutes with the file. I spent considerably more." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because the file was interesting. Because someone who declines 3 candidates in 3 years on individually reasoned grounds is doing something more careful than the clause's mandatory review mechanism was designed to catch. I wanted to understand what she was doing." Velsorn Keith Yareth looked at me across the work table. She said, "And do you understand it?" I said, "I think so. You are not refusing the clause. You are applying it correctly. The clause is supposed to be voluntary. You are treating it as voluntary. The 3 candidates you declined were not right for you. You said so, clearly and specifically, without being unkind to any of them. The system flagged you because 3 specific declines looked the same to a counting mechanism as 3 evasive ones." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the river made its sound, which is a low, continuous note in the upper register. Not quite musical, not quite mechanical, that I had stopped noticing years ago and had started noticing again since she arrived. She said, "That is the most accurate description of my situation I have heard from anyone inside the Integration Directorate." I said, "I am not inside the Integration Directorate. I am a Grade 3 adjudication officer in a frontier township. We are a different branch." She looked at me again. Then something shifted in her expression, not large, not dramatic, just a small internal rearrangement of whatever she had been holding in the careful, precise way she held most things. She said, "Yes, I am beginning to understand that." She went back to her survey document. I went back to my interaction logs. The second botanical specimen migrated from the kitchen windowsill to the work table before the end of the week. I noted it in my own records and said nothing. The third week I stopped thinking of the assessment as an assessment in the way I usually do, which is the first sign I have ever noticed in myself that something has shifted in a co-residency case that I had not planned for. I want to be precise about what I mean, because I am the kind of person who is precise about things, and imprecision here would be a failure. I have conducted 14 co-residency assessments over 12 years. In those assessments, I have lived alongside candidates who were frightened, candidates who were angry, candidates who were lonely, candidates who were relieved to have a mandate to be proximate to another person, and candidates who were genuinely, authentically working through the clause's requirements with full good faith. I had never, in 12 years, found myself thinking about the assessment candidate when I was not in the unit. In the third week, I found myself thinking about the river platform argument. Not the argument itself. I had already cataloged that, but the specific quality of how she had come back the next morning and said she was partially wrong. The precision of it. The way she had not softened the concession into something easier by acknowledging it in a roundabout way. She had just said it, plainly, in the middle of other things, with the tone of someone filing an accurate amendment to a previous record. I thought about the botanical specimens. The third one had joined the other 2 on the work table by day 16. There were now 3 small clay pots in a row at the corner of the work table nearest my desk, with gaps of equal width between them and the faint green smell they produced in the morning light, which was not unpleasant. She had moved them without saying anything about it. I had not said anything about it either. I thought about the evenings. By the third week, she had started coming to the river platform in the evenings. Not because I had invited her, I had not, and not because she had changed her position about mornings being better, which she maintained throughout with the same geological survey precision she brought to everything. She came in the evenings because, she told me later, the daily interaction log listed my evening river platform visits as a consistent pattern, and she had decided to assess the light at that hour with fresh attention, as a scientific matter, to determine whether her original concession had been appropriately bounded. She brought her own ground seed concentrate in a thermos on the first evening. She brought 2 thermoses on the second. We sat on the platform in the evening light and argued, quietly and without particular heat, about whether the copper green of the water was a spectral phenomenon or a perceptual one, and whether the distinction mattered for the purposes of a township site documentation report. She said the distinction was fundamental. I said it was interesting, but perhaps not as fundamental as she thought. She said that was because I did not fully understand spectral analysis. I said she was probably right, but that did not resolve the question of which light was better for sitting beside a river. She said, "This is not a competition." I said, "I know, but if it were, you would be winning." She looked at me. Her dark gold eyes had the copper ring clearly visible in the evening light, which I had learned by the 3rd week was one of the reliable indicators of her mood. Not what the mood was exactly, but that the careful internal management she applied to most things was running at lower intensity than usual. In low management moments, the copper ring was more visible. In high management moments, the gold absorbed it. She said, "You are a strange adjudication officer." I said, "I have heard that before." She said, "I am not certain it is a complaint." I said, "I have heard that before too." She looked at the river for a while. Then she said, "The first candidate, I want you to understand something about the first refusal that is not in the file." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know I don't have to, I want to." I waited. She said, "The first candidate filed his declaration 11 days into my integration posting. I had been here 11 days. I did not know the township. I did not know the clause's mechanics in practice, only in theory. I did not know what the process was supposed to feel like. He was not wrong, exactly. The incompatible professional trajectories were real. But the real reason was that I was not ready. I had been in this township for 11 days, and a person I had never spoken to had filed a document with the Integration Directorate expressing interest in a permanent bond. And I did not know him, and I did not know this place, and I was not ready. I said, "That is a sufficient reason." She said, "It is not one of the reasons the clause formally accepts." I said, "No, but it is one of the reasons a person actually has." She was quiet for a moment. The river made its sound. The light was doing what it does in the hour after the sun has moved below the township's western ridge, not dark, not quite bright, something that doesn't have a name. She said, "The second candidate. The stated reason was accurate, but the real reason was also that I was beginning to understand what the clause actually was, and I did not like it. I did not like the idea that my bond was something the Compact Integration Directorate had a system for processing. I did not like that the process was supposed to produce a specific outcome, and that if I kept not producing that outcome, the process would eventually move to a mandatory review, and I would be sitting across from an adjudication officer in a shared housing unit being assessed. She looked at me. I said, "I understand why you would not like that." She said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes, because the clause is a tool. Tools are not always wrong, but they are always imprecise. The thing a tool produces is not always the same as the thing you actually need. You were trying to tell the tool something it did not have a field for." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked back at the river. She said the third candidate was kind. He was thoughtful. His declaration was carefully written, and it was clear he had read my file and thought about what I might find meaningful. I declined him in 22 hours, and I felt afterward that I had done something unkind. But the fundamental orientation mismatch was real. He wanted a bond that looked a particular way, and I did not want the shape he was describing. Not because the shape was wrong, but because it was not mine. I said, "You described it accurately in the file." She said, "I know, but I felt unkind anyway." I said you weren't. You told him the truth quickly, which is the kindest thing you can do. She picked up her thermos and turned it in her hands. She said, "You have been doing this for 12 years, and you have never submitted a declaration." I said, "That is correct." She said, "Is it because of what you said before, about the procedural coercion?" I said, "Partly, but also because I have never been in a township long enough to know someone well enough to feel that a declaration would be honest. A declaration submitted without certainty is a document that says I am interested in the idea of a bond, without saying anything true about the specific person. I don't know how to submit that." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That is the strangest thing I have heard from someone inside the clause's framework." I said, "I told you I'm not." She said, "Inside the clause's framework, yes, I know." We sat on the platform until the light was gone. Then we walked back to the unit. She made the evening meal and I washed the dishes, which had become a division of labor by the third week that neither of us had discussed. Before she went to her room, she moved the third botanical specimen back to the kitchen windowsill and positioned it with exactly the gap she preferred. I noted this in my own records without interpreting it. Some things take longer to understand than the observation itself. Week 4 was when Velthar Orvith arrived. I knew he was coming before he appeared because the Integration Directorate sends a 24-hour notification to the assessing officer when a House delegate files a formal intervention request, which is what a termination of integration order technically is, a House's formal request that the Directorate close the assessment early and return the candidate to House jurisdiction. I read the notification at the adjudication hall at 9 in the morning of day 22 and sat with it for several minutes. The grounds for the termination request were: candidates' consecutive refusals indicate an incompatibility with the integration framework that the mandatory assessment has failed to resolve. Candidates' House affiliation and third-line heir status create administrative complications for a prolonged integration posting. The House delegates request early termination in the candidate's best interests. In my experience, candidates' best interests in a termination request means the House's interests. In this case, the Keth Varath delegation had a political situation that Velsorn Keith Yarath's prolonged integration posting was complicating. I had read enough House delegation files over 12 years to understand the shape of it without needing the specifics. Third-line heirs who spent too long in frontier townships became inconvenient when House succession matters needed to be consolidated. The integration clause was a convenient mechanism for the compact, but it was also a lever that House politics could pull in the other direction when it suited them. I filed a formal response to the Directorate. Assessment in progress, Article 7 Protocol current and proceeding. Assessing officer recommends assessment be allowed to complete before any termination decision is reached. The Directorate replied, "House Delegate Velthar Orvith will be on site in 48 hours. On-site review will determine whether early termination is warranted." I noted this in the daily log. Then I went back to the unit. She was at the work table with her survey documents. All 3 botanical specimens were lined up on the kitchen windowsill in their precise row. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle that showed the copper ring in her eyes, which I had learned by then meant the careful internal management was operating at full intensity. I said, "Velthar Orvith is coming." She did not look up from her document. She said, "I know. He sent notification to my House account this morning." I said, "He's filing a termination of integration request." She said, "I know that too." I said, "I've asked the Directorate to let the assessment complete first." She looked up at that. I said, "You have 4 more weeks of Article 7 protocol. The assessment is proceeding correctly. A termination at this point would not reflect an accurate evaluation of your participation." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Velthar Orvith is a senior House delegate. He has the authority to move a termination order through the directorate over an assessing officer's recommendation. I said, he does. But the assessing officer's formal recommendation is on record, and if the assessment were terminated early without completion, any candidate in the directorate system could challenge the procedural validity of the termination. She was quiet. I said, meaning you could challenge it, if you chose to. She looked at me for a long time. The morning light held its angle. Outside, the river made its sound. She said, why are you telling me this? I said, because it is relevant information for your situation, and you should have it. She said, that is not a complete answer. I set my coffee mug down on the corner of the work table, nearest her botanical specimens. I said, no, it isn't. The complete answer is that I have read your file more carefully than the preliminary review did, and I have spent 4 weeks in a shared housing unit with you, and my professional assessment is that you have been complying with the clause correctly and in good faith, and that a termination order filed by a House delegate for House political reasons should not be the thing that ends your integration posting. That is the complete answer. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, you still have not submitted a declaration. I said, no, I haven't. She said, why not? I said, honestly, because I am still the assessing officer and you are still the candidate, and submitting a declaration now would be exactly the kind of procedural coercion I told you about on the 4th day. She said, and if you were not the assessing officer? I looked at her across the work table with the morning light between us and the botanical specimens in their row, and the survey documents spread in their sequence, and the river doing what the river does in the background of everything in Kethsorn 4 when you've been here long enough to stop noticing it. I said, then I would have submitted it on day 11. She looked at me. The copper ring was visible. The careful internal management was gone. She said, that is the first honest answer I have heard that did not require a procedural explanation. I said, I know. She went back to her survey document. I went back to my interaction logs. Neither of us said anything else until the evening meal. Velthar Orvith arrived on the morning of day 24, which was a clear day in Kethsorn 4 with the particular quality of autumn light that the community market corridor documentation describes as optimal for outdoor market activity. He was efficient, precise, and formally cordial in the way that senior House delegates always are. The cordiality is a practiced layer over the substance, and the substance is that he had come to do a specific thing and expected to do it. He had booked the formal adjudication review room in the integration hall, which is the room with the long table and the recorded log system and the integration flag on the east wall. I met him there at 10:00 with my assessment file current and complete. Velsorn Keith Yareth had been informed the meeting was taking place. She had not been asked to attend. It was a procedural meeting between the delegate and the assessing officer, and candidate attendance was optional under Article 7. Velthar Orvith set his house documentation on the long table and outlined the termination grounds with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. The candidate's refusal history, the integration complication, the House's assessment of her best interests. The delegate's authority under Compact House accords Supplemental Provision 3 to request early termination in cases where prolonged posting creates administrative difficulty. I listened to all of it. Then I laid out my counter-documentation, which was the complete Article 7 assessment file to date, the daily interaction logs, the observation records, the formal response I had sent to the directorate, and a summary finding, preliminary, clearly labeled preliminary, that noted the candidate's participation was genuine and consistent, and that the assessment, if completed, would most likely produce a finding that fully supported her continued integration standing. Velthar Orvith read the preliminary finding. He said, this assessment's completion is not the core issue. The core issue is the Keth-Varath House's administrative position. I said, I understand. I want to note that the formal record of this meeting and the assessing officer's recommendation will be part of the permanent file regardless of the directorate's decision on the termination request. He said, I am aware of how the file system works. I said, I know you are. I am also noting it because any future integration clause participant who reviews this file will see both the House's grounds for termination and the assessing officer's record of a candidate who participated correctly and in good faith. That record is permanent regardless of outcome. Velthar Orvith looked at me for a moment. He was not a man who was easy to read, which is a quality I have encountered in enough senior delegates to recognize it as deliberate. He said, you have an attachment to this assessment. I said, I have a professional obligation to conduct it correctly. He said, those are not always the same thing. I said no, but in this case they are. We were looking at each other across the long table when the adjudication hall door opened. Velsorn Keith Yareth walked in. She was in her formal house integration attire, which is something I had not seen her in during 4 weeks in the unit. She wore working survey clothes in the apartment, practical and plain, but the formal attire is the deep burgundy red of the Keth Vareth third-line tier with the house mark at the collar, and she wore it the way she wore the braid, because she chose to, not because she had to. Her hair was braided with precision. Her dark gold eyes had the copper ring visible, and the careful management entirely gone. Velthar Orvith said, Keitha, this meeting is. She said, I know what this meeting is. She walked past him. She walked to the other side of the long table and stood in front of me. Then she turned so she was facing the adjudication room, facing Velthar Orvith and the house documentation and the compact integration flag and the permanent record system and all of it, with me standing to her left and slightly behind her, which put me at her shoulder. She said, in the formal register of the Kethvareth house line that I had heard her use once before, when she was talking about her grandmother's teaching of the braid, I am Velsorn Keith Yareth, third-line heir of the Kethvareth delegation, integration candidate under Article 7 of the Compact Integration Bonding Clause. I am exercising my right under Article 7 subsection F to make a formal candidate declaration within the active assessment window. Velthar Orvith said, Keithai. She said, Article 7 subsection F, I know you know it. He was quiet. She said, I am declaring before the assessing officer and the permanent record of this adjudication hall that I am naming a bonding candidate under the clause. I am naming Orrin Dale, Grade 3 Adjudication Officer, Kethsorn 4 Township, Compact Integration Service. The room was quiet. Velthar Orvith said, the assessing officer is not. She said, the clause applies to all compact citizens in active frontier posting status within the township boundary. The assessing officer qualifies. The candidacy restrictions in Article 7 apply to candidates the officer nominates during the assessment window, not to candidates the assessed person nominates. I have read the clause carefully. I have been reading it for 3 years. She turned to look at me. Her dark gold eyes with the copper ring at the iris were looking at me with an expression I had been learning for 4 weeks and had not fully named until this moment, because you cannot fully name something while you are still in the middle of learning it. I could name it now. She said, Orrin Dale, I'm asking. I said, yes. She held my eyes for one more moment. Then she turned back to Velthar Orvith and said, the declaration is on the record. Under Article 7 subsection F, a candidate declaration filed by the assessed person supersedes a pending house termination request and requires full assessment completion before any termination can be processed. I believe you will find that in the Compact House accords supplemental provisions as well. Provision 9. Velthar Orvith looked at his house documentation, then he looked at her, then he looked at me. He said, I will be consulting with the house legal team. She said, of course. He gathered his documentation and left. The adjudication hall was quiet. She turned back to me. The careful management was still completely gone. Something else was there instead, something quieter and wider, like the river light in the hour after the sun moves below the ridge. She said, "I have wanted to do that for a long time." I said, "Which part?" She said, "All of it, the clause correctly, the declaration honestly, the choosing." I said, "Are you all right?" She looked at me with the expression I could now name. She said, "I am more all right than I have been in 3 years." I said, "Good. Then I have a formal response to file, and you should probably go change out of the formal attire before the morning survey work." She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh, not a restrained sound, not a polished one, but a genuine unpracticed thing that belonged to her in a way that none of the careful management did. She said, "You are still the most peculiar adjudication officer I have encountered." I said, "You've been noting that for 4 weeks." She said, "I have. I believe it is my favorite thing about you." The assessment completed on schedule. The formal finding noted genuine and consistent participation across the full 6-week window, a candidate declaration under Article 7 subsection F, and a recommendation for continued integration standing. The Integration Directorate accepted the finding. The House legal team reviewed Provision 9 and declined to pursue the termination request further. These are the facts of the official record. What the official record does not note is the river platform on the evening of day 24, after the adjudication hall and the formal attire and the delegate's departure, when she came down to the water in her survey clothes with 2 thermoses and sat beside me in the low copper-green light. She said, "I was right about morning spectral range." I said, "You were." She said, "And you were right about evening tonal coherence." I said, "I was." She said, "We are both correct about different things. I find this satisfying." I said, "So do I." The river made its sound. The light did what it does in the transitional hour, the thing that doesn't have a name in any language I know. We sat with our thermoses and the sound and the light, and the fact that neither of us was arguing about which hour was better, because for the first time since the assessment had started, we were both there at the same hour by choice rather than schedule. She said, after a while, "I want to tell you something that is not in any file." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "When I moved the first botanical specimen to your side of the work table on the 4th day, it was because you had said something I had not heard from anyone inside the clause's framework, about the procedural coercion, about not submitting a declaration because it would not be honest. I moved the specimen because I wanted to be closer to whatever was producing that kind of thinking, and it was the only thing I could do that would not require a declaration." I said, "I noticed." She said, "I know you noticed." I said, "I did not say anything because I did not want to misread it." She said, "You read it correctly. You have been reading things correctly since the 1st week. That is the second of my favorite things about you." I said, "What is the first?" She thought about it with the same precision she brought to survey methodology and spectral light analysis, and the spaces between botanical specimens on a windowsill. She said, "That you waited until I was ready to ask." I looked at the river for a moment. Then I said, "You waited 3 years. I thought you had earned the asking." She was quiet. When I looked at her, the copper ring was fully visible in the evening light, and the thing I could now name was fully present in her expression, and the light was doing the thing it does, and the river was doing the thing it does, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. Which was, I decided, exactly the right amount to say. The assessment file closed 6 weeks from the day it started. I filed the formal finding, updated the directorate records, and transferred the case to completed status. Then I walked to the community market corridor and bought a second clay mug, one without anyone else's name scratched into the bottom, and brought it back to the unit. She was at the work table with her survey documents. All 3 botanical specimens were lined up in their row at the corner nearest my desk, with the gaps of exactly equal width between them and the green smell in the morning light. I set the mug on the kitchen counter. She looked at it, then she looked at me. She said, "That is a new mug." I said, "The old one had someone else's name on it." She said, "And the new one?" I said, "No name yet." She held my eyes for a moment with the copper ring visible. Then she picked up her stylus and went back to her survey document, but the precise corner of her mouth that I had been learning for 6 weeks did the thing it does when the careful management is running at its lowest possible setting. I poured the coffee and sat down at my adjudication desk. Outside, the river made its sound,